One step through a rupture in space, and an enemy becomes a shared breath. In a room that shouldn't exist, hatred melts into a whisper, and the silence between them weighs more than a war. The story is being written in this very moment. The tapestries in the 7th floor corridor did not merely hang. They exhaled the damp, heavy scent of centuries. Hermione Granger's dragon-hide boots made no sound against the stone, yet the silence of Hogwarts at 3 a.m. felt deafening, a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. As head girl, the autonomy of the night was hers, but the solitude was a jagged thing. It scraped against her nerves, reminding her that the war had ended, yet the quiet was never truly peaceful. It was merely an absence of screaming. She stopped before a frayed hanging depicting Andromeda Black, not the sister of Narcissa, but the ancient namesake, draped in heavy silks of charcoal and silver. The magic here felt thin, like parchment worn translucent by too many erasures. Hermione reached out, her fingers hovering inches from the woven threads. There was a localized pressure in the air, a hum of static electricity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand rigid. Logic dictated she report the fluctuation to Professor McGonagall. Curiosity, that persistent, gnawing itch in the back of her skull, dictated she investigate. Her fingertips brushed the silk. The wall didn't slide or pivot, it dissolved. The physical sensation was less like walking through a door and more like a visceral alignment of two disparate spaces. For a fleeting second, the oxygen left her lungs, replaced by the sharp metallic tang of ozone and the deep, grounding scent of sandalwood. Hermione stumbled. Her equilibrium shattered as her boots met not cold corridor stone, but the plush, emerald-dark weave of an expensive rug. She was no longer in the hallway. The room was bathed in the flickering amber glow of a dying fire. It was a space of sharp angles and suffocating luxury. Silver instruments sat motionless on a mahogany desk, and the air carried the rhythmic, heavy tick of a grandfather clock that sounded like a slowing heart. Granger? The voice was a low rasp, cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. Hermione froze. Her hand flew to the cuff of her left sleeve, her fingers digging into the fabric, a nervous, frantic habit she hadn't managed to break since the drawing room at Malfoy Manor. She turned slowly, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Draco Malfoy was not in bed. He was sitting in a high-backed velvet chair by the hearth, a glass of amber liquid held loosely in his right hand. He wasn't wearing his school robes. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the throat, the sleeves rolled up to reveal pale forearms that seemed almost translucent in the firelight. "Malfoy," she breathed, the name catching in her constricted throat. He didn't move, but the atmosphere in the room tightened. It was a magnetic pull, a sudden increase in barometric pressure that made it difficult to draw a full breath. His eyes, grey as a stormy North Sea, tracked her movement with a predatory stillness. There was no sneer, no practiced insult. There was only a hollow, haunting exhaustion that made him look like a ghost inhabiting a living body. "How?" he asked. The word was short, clipped, vibrating with a tremor he couldn't quite suppress. "The tapestry," Hermione whispered, her eyes darting to the wall behind her. There was no door, only the solid, dark stone of the Slytherin dungeons. The anomaly had closed, or perhaps it had simply shifted. I wasn't looking for you." "Of course not." He stood up, the movement fluid but brittle. He set the glass down on a side table with a sharp clack of crystal against wood. The sound echoed in the hollow space between them. The golden girl doesn't look for monsters in their dens. She stumbles upon them by divine right. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent. Hermione stood her ground, though every instinct told her to retreat until she hit the stone. As he entered her personal space, the scent of him, cold rain and expensive soap, overwhelmed the sandalwood. He stopped a breath away. The height difference forced her to tilt her head back. She could see the faint, rhythmic pulse in his neck, and the way his knuckles whitened as he clenched his fists at his sides. The tension was a living thing, a cord stretched to the point of snapping. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous velvet whisper. "I know. This is my only space, Granger. The only place where the walls don't have eyes and the floor doesn't remember what I've done." He leaned in closer, his shadow swallowing her whole. "And now you've stained it." The word stained hit her like a physical blow. Her indignation flared, a hot spark in the cold vacuum of her fear. "I am not a stain, Malfoy, and I didn't ask for the castle to deposit me in your bedroom. Then leave." He gestured vaguely at the wall, his silver signet ring catching the firelight. The bite of the metal against his skin seemed to anchor him. "Find the magic that brought you here and undo it. Or are you waiting for me to provide tea and a confession?" Hermione felt the warmth of anger beginning to recede, replaced by a sharp, analytical observation. Up close, the Malfoy she knew, the arrogant, sharp-tongued boy, was a crumbling facade. The man standing before her was held together by sheer, agonizing willpower. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin beneath them bruised with permanent shadows. "You're shaking," she noted, her voice softer than she intended. The reaction was instantaneous. Draco recoiled, as if she had struck him with a stinging jinx. His face hardened, the features turning to marble. The vulnerability she had glimpsed was slammed behind a vault door. "Get out!" he hissed. "Before I find a way to make you regret every virtuous step you've ever taken." Hermione turned to the wall, her fingers searching for the thread of magic she had felt earlier. The stone was cold, unresponsive. She felt a surge of genuine panic, not of him, but of the permanence of the situation. She pressed her palms against the masonry, her breath coming in shallow hitches. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The passage, it's closed." A heavy silence descended, broken only by the crackle of a log shifting in the grate. Draco didn't speak. He didn't move. The atmospheric pressure reached a breaking point where the air felt thick enough to swallow. "So," he said eventually, his voice devoid of all emotion, a hollow echo in a vacant corridor. "It seems we are trapped in the dark together, Granger. How very poetic." He turned his back on her and walked back to his chair, leaving her standing against the cold stone. The distance between them felt like miles, yet the magnetic friction remained, a tether that refused to be cut. Hermione watched the way the firelight played across his narrow shoulders, the silence between them growing into something heavy, expectant, and terrifyingly intimate. She wasn't just in his room. She was inside his solitude. And as the clock continued its relentless, rhythmic beat, she realized that the door she had stepped through was one that could never truly be closed again. The silence in the room was not a void. It was was a pressurized chamber. Hermione remained pressed against the cold stone of the wall, her palms flat against the masonry, as if she could coax the molecular structure of the castle to surrender. Nothing moved. The ancient magic that had deposited her here had retracted like a tide, leaving her stranded on a shore of dark velvet and silver. Across the room, Draco Malfoy had reclaimed his chair. He did not look at her. He stared into the dying embers of the hearth, his profile etched in sharp skeletal lines by the flickering orange light. The glass of amber liquid remained untouched on the table beside him, the condensation pooling into a ring that mirrored the silver of his family crest. "Stop scratching at the stone, Granger," he said, his voice a low melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "It's undignified, even for a Gryffindor." "There has to be a structural reason," she whispered, her voice sounding thin and alien in the heavy atmosphere. She ignored him, her fingers tracing the mortar. "A spatial fold. Hogwarts is sentient, Draco. It doesn't move people without intent." The use of his first name caused a visible jolt in his posture. His shoulders tightened, the fine linen of his shirt straining against the blade-like protrusion of his scapula. He finally turned his head, his gaze dragging across the room to meet hers. It was a heavy, tactile look, one that felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. "Intent?" he repeated, a ghost of a sneer curling his lip, though it lacked its usual venom. "The castle is a senile collection of bricks and bad memories. If it put you here, it's because it has a sick sense of humor. Or perhaps it simply wanted to see if the golden girl would shatter when dropped into the dark." He stood up, the movement slow and deliberate, a predator uncoiling in a cage. As he walked toward her, the scent of sandalwood and something sharper, the ozone of a lingering hex, preceded him. He stopped just outside the circle of her personal space, the atmospheric pressure between them rising until the air felt thick enough to swallow. "You're analyzing the stonework because you're terrified to analyze the room," he challenged, his voice dropping to a velvet murmur. "Look at it. Look at where you are." Hermione forced herself to pull her gaze from the wall. Her eyes swept over the space. The towering shelves of dark, leather-bound books, many of them banned or ancient. The silver basin on the washstand, the heavy emerald-green hangings of the massive four-poster bed that stood like a silent sentinel in the corner. It was a room of solitude, of a man who lived entirely inside his own head because the world outside was a minefield. "It's just a room, Malfoy," she lied, her voice trembling. "Liar." He stepped closer. The distance was now negligible. She could see the minute tremor in his hands, the way he gripped the edge of a nearby bookshelf until his knuckles were white as bone. "It's a tomb, and you've just walked into it with all your life, all your righteous fire. You're practically glowing with it, and it's revolting." The word was harsh, but his eyes betrayed him. They were fixed on her with a desperate, starving intensity. The friction between them was no longer just hostility. It was a magnetic misalignment. She felt a sudden, frantic need to straighten her already perfect sleeve cuffs, her fingers fumbling with the fabric. "If it's a tomb, why do you stay here?" she asked, her voice regaining its strength. "Why not go to the common room? Why isolate yourself until you look like a spectre?" Draco let out a short, jagged laugh that didn't reach his eyes. because the common room is full of people who either want to be me or want to kill me for what I fail to be. Here, I am only a disappointment to myself. It's a much more manageable audience." He reached out, his hand hovering near the stray curl that had escaped her pins. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, a sharp contrast to the chill of the dungeons. The air between them hummed with a static charge. Hermione's breath hitched. She should have pulled away, should have reached for her wand, but she was paralyzed by the sheer visceral gravity of his presence. "You think you're the only one who feels trapped," she whispered, her eyes searching his. "The war didn't just end for you, Draco. We're all walking through ruins." His hand dropped, the silver ring on his finger catching the light with a sharp metallic glint. Don't try to find common ground with me, Granger. Your ruins are built of marble and metals. Mine are built of ash." He turned away abruptly, the warmth he had momentarily exuded replaced by a sudden biting cold. The transition was so sharp it made her shiver. He walked back to the hearth and, with a flick of his wand, extinguished the remaining embers. The room was plunged into a suffocating charcoal darkness, save for the thin sliver of moonlight filtering through a high enchanted window that looked out into the depths of the Black Lake. "The passage will likely reset at dawn," he said from the shadows, his voice distant and cold as ice. "Stay on the rug. Don't touch anything. Don't look at me. Draco." Silence. The word was a command, but it held a jagged edge of plea. Hermione sank onto the edge of the velvet armchair, her heart still performing a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. The darkness did not hide him. It only made her more aware of him. She could hear his rhythmic, shallow breathing from the other side of the room. She could feel the hollow echo of his footsteps as he paced a small strip of floor near the bed. The tension did not dissipate. It settled into the marrow of the room. It was a slow burn, a steady accumulation of unsaid words and repressed impulses. Every time the floorboard creaked or the water of the lake shifted against the glass, the magnetic pull between them tightened. Hermione wrapped her arms around herself, her fingers digging into the wool of her sweater. She thought of the library, of the safety of her schedules and her logic. But those things felt like toys now, flimsy constructs in the face of this raw atmospheric reality. He was a monster, she told herself. He was the boy who had watched her bleed on his floor. And yet, as she sat in the dark, the scent of his sandalwood lingering in her lungs, she couldn't stop the treacherous thought that the monster was the only person in the castle who looked as broken as she felt. Hours passed in a state of hyper-awareness. The darkness was tactile, a heavy shroud that amplified every sound. Then, as the first faint grey light of pre-dawn began to filter through the water, the wall behind her began to thrum. The hum of static returned. The ozone sharpened. Hermione stood up, her legs stiff. She looked toward the bed where Draco was now sitting, his head in his hands, his silver hair a pale blur in the gloom. He didn't look up as the wall began to shimmer, the weave of the Andromeda tapestry reappearing through the stone like a ghost. "It's opening," she said, her voice a mere breath. He didn't move. "Go then. Back to your tower. Back to the light." She hesitated at the threshold, the physical sensation of the passage calling to her, a visceral alignment waiting to be completed. She wanted to say something, a thank you, a curse, a promise. But the words died in the cold air. As she stepped through the dissolve, the last thing she felt was the sharp, biting pressure of his gaze on her back, a look that felt like a brand. She emerged into the 7th floor corridor, the scent of damp silk and old dust hitting her like a physical blow. The sun was not yet up, but the world felt garish and loud. She stood before the tapestry of Andromeda black, her heart still trapped in a dungeon room 3 floors below. She smoothed her skirts, her fingers trembling. She had escaped the room, but as she walked away, the hollow echo of her own footsteps told her the truth. She had left a piece of her resolve behind, locked in a dark room with a man who was no longer just an enemy, but a secret she wasn't sure she could keep. The great hall was a cathedral of noise, a cacophony of clattering cutlery and the relentless, bright chatter of students who had not spent their night breathing in the scent of sandalwood and damp stone. Hermione sat at the Gryffindor table, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on a bowl of porridge she hadn't touched. The sunlight streaming through the enchanted ceiling felt abrasive, a garish intrusion into the shadowed corners of her mind where the memory of Draco Malfoy's room still flickered like a dying ember. Across the hall, the Slytherin table was a sea of polished silver and green. Draco sat amidst his peers, yet he looked as though he were encased in glass. His movements were clinical, precise. The way he lifted a silver spoon, the way he inclined his head to listen to Pansy Parkinson's sharp, trilling laughter. But when he looked up, his gaze caught hers for a fraction of a heartbeat. It was a visceral alignment, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure that made the air in the great hall feel too thin to breathe. He broke the contact instantly, his mouth thinning into a line of cold indifference. The rejection stung more than his insults ever had. It was a betrayal of the silence they had shared, a deliberate reconstruction of the walls she had seen crumble in the dark. "Hermione, you're crushing your napkin." Ginny's voice pulled her back. Hermione looked down to find her knuckles white, her fingers digging into the linen with a frantic intensity. She forced her hand to relax, smoothing the fabric with a tremor she couldn't hide. "I'm just tired, Ginny. A lot of patrol work lately." "You look like you've seen a ghost," Ginny noted, her eyes narrowed with a sharp, perceptive kindness. "Or like you're waiting for one to appear." The day dragged on with agonizing slowness. Every hollow echo of footsteps in the vacant corridors made Hermione jump. Every time a blonde head appeared in the periphery of her vision, her heart performed a jagged, irregular rhythm against her ribs. She felt like a fraud, a spy in her own life. The principled head girl was gone, replaced by someone who couldn't stop thinking about the bite of a silver ring against pale skin. The confrontation happened in the library, in the narrow, dusty aisle of the advanced potions section. Hermione was reaching for a volume on complex drafts when a shadow fell over her. The scent of rain and expensive soap preceded him, a magnetic pull that she recognized with a terrifying certainty. "Still searching for answers in books, Granger." Draco's voice was a low rasp, but here, in the public light, it carried a jagged edge of his old arrogance. He was leaning against the mahogany shelf, his arms crossed over his chest. His school robes were impeccable, but the skin beneath his eyes was still bruised with exhaustion. "And you're still hiding behind sneers, Malfoy," she retorted, though her voice lacked its usual bite. She straightened her sleeve cuffs, a nervous habit that drew his gaze to her wrists. "I thought we had moved past the theatrics." "We haven't moved anywhere," he hissed, stepping closer. The atmospheric pressure in the aisle surged. The tooth of old parchment and the scent of ozone from a nearby student's failed hex filled the space between them. "Last night was a fluke, a malfunction of the castle. It didn't happen." "It did happen," she whispered, her eyes searching his stormy grey ones. "I saw you, Draco. Not the Malfoy heir, not the Death Eater. I saw you." His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the bookshelf. The wood groaned under the pressure. "You saw nothing but a man who couldn't sleep. Don't build a monument out of a moment of weakness. It's pathetic, even for a Gryffindor." "Is that what you tell yourself? That being human is a weakness?" Hermione stepped into his space, her indignation flaring like a hot spark. "You're so afraid of someone seeing the cracks that you'd rather stay in that tomb of a room until you rot." The insult hit its mark. Draco's face turned to marble, his features sharpening into a mask of pure blood coldness. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a sharp contrast to the biting chill of his words. "My room is a sanctuary because people like you aren't in it," he said, each word a cold, precise strike. "You're a nuisance, Granger. A buzzing insect that thinks because it felt the sun once, it understands the fire. Stay away from that tapestry. If I find you in my quarters again, I won't be so hollow in my response." He turned on his heel and strode away, his cloak billowing behind him like a dark wing. Hermione stood frozen in the aisle, the tactile friction of his presence still vibrating in the air. Her chest ached with a sudden, sharp cold. The warmth they had shared, the hesitant, unspoken truce of the night, had been systematically dismantled. She spent the rest of the evening in a state of brittle silence. She tried to study, but the words on the page were meaningless shapes. Her mind was a loop of his rejection, a constant replay of the way his eyes had hardened when she mentioned his humanity. By midnight, the Gryffindor common room was empty, the fire reduced to a heap of glowing coals. Hermione stood before the portrait hole, her hand on the latch. Logic screamed at her to go to bed, to forget the passage, to let the wall remain a wall. But the magnetic pull was too strong. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was a visceral need to bridge the distance he had created. She climbed to the 7th floor, her breath hitching in the cold air. The corridor was silent, the tapestry of Andromeda black hanging motionless in the shadows. Hermione reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the silk. The wall dissolved. This time, the room was not dark. It was flooded with the harsh, flickering light of a dozen candles. Draco was standing in the center of the rug, his wand drawn, his chest heaving as if he had been running. The room was in disarray. Books were scattered on the floor. A silver inkwell had been overturned, staining the mahogany desk with a dark, spreading pool. He looked up as she stumbled through the threshold. The shock on his face was replaced by a raw, jagged fury. "I told you," he breathed, his voice trembling with a tremor he couldn't suppress. "I told you to stay away." "You were having a nightmare," she said, her voice a mere breath. I could feel it, even through the stone. "Get out," he roared, but as he stepped toward her, his legs gave way. He collapsed against the edge of the bed, his head falling into his hands. The Malfoy she had seen in the library was gone, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Hermione didn't leave. She crossed the room, her boots making soft thuds on the plush rug. The atmospheric pressure was suffocating, thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy metallic tang of his fear. She stopped a foot away from him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She didn't speak. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply sat on the edge of the velvet armchair he had occupied the night before, her presence a silent weight in the room. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Draco's breathing slowed, though his hands continued to shake. He didn't look at her, but he didn't scream again. The coldness he had wielded like a weapon in the library had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, haunting vulnerability. "Why?" he whispered into the palms of his hands. "Why do you keep coming back to the dark?" "Because you're here," she replied, the truth of it hitting her with the force of a physical blow. He finally looked up, his grey eyes searching hers with a desperate, starving intensity. The tension in the room shifted, turning from a cord about to snap into a magnetic alignment of two fractured souls. He reached out, his hand hovering near her knee, his fingers trembling just inches from the fabric of her skirt. The warmth returned, a slow, steady thrum that started in her chest and radiated outward. But just as his fingers brushed the wool, a sudden, sharp sound echoed from the corridor outside, the heavy, rhythmic thud of Filch's boots. The magnetic pull snapped. Draco recoiled, his face hardening instantly. The cold returned, more biting than before. "Go," he hissed, his voice a sharp blade, "before you ruin everything." Hermione stood up, her fingers digging into her palms. The trust she had felt beginning to form was replaced by a sharp, bitter doubt. Was he protecting her, or was he ashamed of her? She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and fled through the shimmering wall, the scent of sandalwood clinging to her clothes like a brand. As she emerged into the cold corridor, the wall behind her solidified with a final, heavy thud. She was back in the light, but the shadows of the dungeon were now etched into her skin. The seesaw had tilted again, leaving her balanced on a jagged edge between warmth and a cold that felt like it would never end. The following week was a study in atmospheric erosion. The castle felt increasingly like a rib cage, holding Hermione in a skeletal grip that tightened with every passing hour. In the daylight, the distance between her and Draco Malfoy was an abyss. They passed each other in the Transfiguration courtyard, his eyes as cold and flat as coins, his expression an impenetrable mask of pure blood indifference. Every time she saw him, the warmth she had felt in the dungeon seemed like a fever dream, a trick played by the flickering candlelight and her own exhaustion. The doubt began to fester. It wasn't just the rejection in the Great Hall. It was the realization that she knew nothing of the man who occupied the other side of that secret door. She was Hermione Granger, the girl who needed to understand the mechanics of everything. Yet she was orbiting a dark star whose gravity was as dangerous as it was undeniable. By Thursday, the rain had returned, a relentless grey drumming against the high windows of the library. Hermione sat at her usual table, but her quill remained dry. The scent of old parchment, usually her greatest comfort, now felt like a reminder of things stagnant and dead. She found herself staring at the rhythmic, heavy movement of the clock's pendulum. Approach, repulsion, warmth, cold. The cycle was wearing her thin. She waited until the castle was drowning in the midnight downpour before she climbed to the 7th floor. The air in the corridor was thick with the scent of damp stone and the faint, sweet rot of old flowers from a nearby vase. She approached the tapestry of Andromeda black with a sense of trepidation that bordered on physical nausea. She shouldn't go. She should turn back, find her bed, and seal her mind against him. Her fingers touched the silk. The visceral alignment was instantaneous. She stepped through the dissolve and into a room that felt entirely different. The fire was roaring, but the light it cast was jagged and restless. Draco was not in his chair. He was standing by the window that looked out into the black lake, his forehead pressed against the glass. He didn't turn when she entered. The silence was not peaceful. It was a coiled spring. "You're late," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp that vibrated through the floorboards. "I wasn't coming at all," she replied, her voice steady despite the frantic rhythm of her heart. She stayed near the threshold, her hand still hovering near the stone wall. "After what you said in the library, I thought—" "I don't care what you thought, Granger." He turned around, and the sight of him made her breath hitch. His shirt was discarded on the bed, and he stood in his trousers, his pale skin gleaming like ivory in the firelight. But it was his left arm that held her gaze. The dark mark was not as she remembered it. It was no longer a static black ink stain. It was inflamed, the skin around the serpent's head a bruised, angry red. Thin silver lines, self-inflicted or magical, she couldn't tell, intersected the mark, as if he had tried to carve the shame out of his own meat. The atmospheric pressure in the room surged. The scent of ozone and copper, the smell of blood, filled the air. "What did you do?" she whispered, her fingers digging into her palms. "I tried to make it stop screaming," he said, a horrific, hollow laugh escaping his throat. He looked down at his arm with a detached sort of loathing. "Every time you walk through that door, it burns. It reminds me of what I am. It reminds me that I'm a wolf in the fold, and you're the lamb who keeps offering her throat." "I am not a lamb, Draco." "Then what are you?" He crossed the room in 3 long, predatory strides. He stopped so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, the tactile friction of his presence making her head spin. He grabbed her wrist, his grip not painful but desperate, a visceral alignment of skin on skin. "Why do you come back to a man who wants to destroy everything you represent?" The betrayal of his words hit her, but the warmth of his hand against her pulse was a counter-narrative. Hermione looked up at him, her eyes tracing the jagged lines of his face. The Malfoy mask was gone. There was only a boy who was drowning, trying to pull her under so he wouldn't be alone in the dark. "I come back because I don't believe you want to destroy me," she said, her voice dropping to a velvet whisper. "I think you're terrified that you might actually want to save me, or that I might save you." His knuckles whitened as he tightened his grip. The silver ring on his finger bit into her skin, a sharp, metallic reminder of his lineage. For a second, she thought he would strike her or scream. Instead, he let out a shuddering breath and leaned his forehead against hers. The scent of sandalwood and sweat overwhelmed her. "You can't save a ruin, Hermione," he breathed, his voice breaking on her name. "You can rebuild it," she countered. For a moment, the tension shifted. The magnetic pull turned from hostility to a desperate, aching intimacy. He didn't move to kiss her, but the air between their lips was charged with a static intensity that felt like the moment before a lightning strike. The silence was thick, expectant, a bridge being built in the middle of a storm. Then the cold returned. A sharp silver light flared from the desk. A small, ornate mirror, a communication device, began to vibrate, emitting a low, rhythmic hum. Draco's posture turned to stone. He dropped her wrist as if she were made of fire. "It's my mother," he said, his voice turning clinical, distant. The transition was so sudden, it felt like a physical blow. He walked to the desk, his back to her, the inflamed mark on his arm a jagged reminder of the world outside this room. "You need to leave. Now." "Draco, wait!" "I said leave," he hissed, his eyes catching hers in the mirror's reflection. They were no longer stormy. They were dead. The warmth was gone, replaced by a biting winter chill. "Do you think this is a game? If she sees you, if anyone knows you're here, I won't be the only one who ends up as Ash. Go back to your books and your heroes, Granger. You don't belong in this shadow." The rejection was final. The trust she had felt building was replaced by a sharp, bitter doubt. Was he protecting her, or was he simply choosing his side? The emotional friction was so intense, it felt like her heart was being pulled in two directions. She turned to the wall, her movements clumsy and frantic. She pressed her palms against the stone, searching for the hum of the magic. The wall didn't dissolve immediately. It resisted her, as if the room itself was trying to keep her trapped in the cold. "Don't come back," Draco said, his voice a hollow echo from the desk. "The door is closed." Finally, the wall gave way. Hermione stumbled into the 7th floor corridor, the cold rain still drumming against the castle walls. She felt raw, her skin still humming from the touch of his hand, her mind a chaotic swirl of the sight of his ruined arm and the sound of his mother's mirror. She leaned against the tapestry, her breath coming in shallow hitches. The seesaw had tilted so far into the cold, she wasn't sure if it would ever return to the light. He had let her in, shown her his deepest shame, and then shoved her out as if she were nothing more than a nuisance. As she walked away, her footsteps echoing in the vacant corridor, she realized the true danger of the room. It wasn't the magic or the dark mark. It was the fact that even now, with his insults ringing in her ears and the biting chill of his rejection in her bones, she was already counting the minutes until the sun went down again. The door might be closed, but the lock was broken, and she was the only one who held the key. The aftermath of the mirror's chime felt like a physical bruising. For 3 days, Hermione moved through Hogwarts as a ghost might, present only in the rhythmic scratching of her quill and the hollow echo of her footsteps in the library. She avoided the 7th floor. She avoided the Great Hall during peak hours. But she could not avoid the atmospheric pressure that seemed to follow her, a localized storm of doubt and magnetic longing that made the very air of the castle feel heavy with the scent of sandalwood and ozone. She immersed herself in the restricted section, seeking the logic behind the anomaly. If she could understand the door, she could control the pull. She found a crumbling ledger titled Architectural Echoes of the Founders, its parchment so thin it felt like the tooth of a dried leaf. It spoke of sympathetic resonances, spaces in the castle that folded upon themselves when 2 inhabitants shared a specific frequency of isolation. It wasn't a secret passage. It was a magical rupture, born of mutual, agonizing loneliness. The realization was a jagged impact. The door hadn't appeared because she was curious. It had appeared because she and Draco Malfoy were vibrating on the same frequency of ruin. "Information won't help you with this one, Granger." The voice was a low rasp, cutting through the silence of the library stacks. Hermione didn't turn. She didn't need to. The tactile friction of his presence was already humming against her skin. Draco was standing behind her, the scent of cold rain and expensive soap drowning out the smell of old ink. "You're following me," she whispered, her fingers gripping the edge of the ledger until her knuckles were white. "Hardly. I'm simply reclaiming my territory." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over the book. He was wearing his heavy winter robes, the silver fastenings catching the dim light of the library's lanterns. "You've been digging. I can see the dust on your sleeves. What are you looking for? A way to seal the breach?" "A way to understand why it exists," she retorted, finally turning to face him. The library was empty, the shadows between the shelves long and deep. The tension between them was a living thing, a cord stretched so tight it vibrated. Up close, Draco looked even more frayed than he had in the dungeon. The pale skin of his face seemed almost translucent, stretched tight over his high cheekbones. "It exists because the castle is as broken as we are," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous velvet whisper. He reached out, his hand hovering near the shelf, the bite of his silver ring against the dark wood sounding like a gunshot in the silence. "It's a glitch, Hermione. A mistake, and mistakes should be corrected." "Is that what I am to you? A mistake?" The question hung in the air, a visceral alignment of her vulnerability and his pride. For a moment, the coldness in his eyes wavered. The stormy grey softened, replaced by a raw, starving intensity that made her heart perform a frantic rhythm. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. The atmospheric pressure surged, the scent of him overwhelming her senses. "You are a complication I cannot afford," he breathed. He reached out, his fingers brushing the stray curls at her temple. It was the first intentional touch in the light of day, and it felt like a brand. The warmth was sudden and intoxicating, a sharp contrast to the biting chill of the library. Hermione's breath hitched. She saw his gaze drop to her lips, and for a fleeting second, the can't help but think won the battle over the can't stand it. But then he pulled back. The transition was a jagged withdrawal. His hand dropped to his side, and the mask of indifference slid back into place. "My mother is coming to the school tomorrow," he said, his voice turning clinical and cold. "The Board of Governors. She'll be in my quarters. If that door opens while she's there." "I understand," Hermione said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and a sudden, sharp betrayal. "You're afraid of her. You're afraid of what you are when you're not alone with me in the dark." "I am protecting you, you stubborn girl," he hissed, his eyes flashing with a sudden, jagged fury. "Any idea what they would do to you? To any idea what they would do to you? To your principled reputation? To your life? You think this is some romantic tryst. It's a death sentence." "I don't care about my reputation, Draco. I care about the fact that you keep pushing me away every time the light hits us. Because the light is where we die," he said, his voice breaking. He let go of her and turned away, his footsteps echoing in the vacant corridor as he strode toward the exit. Hermione stood in the shadows of the library, the seesaw of their relationship having tilted once again into a terrifying, icy abyss. He had admitted he was protecting her, yet the protection felt like a cage. That night, the 7th floor was silent, but the air felt charged, as if a storm were brewing within the stone itself. Hermione stood before the tapestry of Andromeda black, her heart heavy with a profound sense of doubt. Should she go through? Should she trust the man who had just warned her of her own destruction? She touched the silk. The hum was different this time, higher, more frantic. The visceral alignment was forced, a jarring impact that left her breathless as she stumbled into the bedroom. The room was in darkness, save for a single candle on the desk. Draco was standing by the window, his back to her. He was fully dressed, even his travelling cloak draped over the chair. The atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension, not just the magnetic pull between them, but a cold, external fear. "She's here," he whispered without turning. "She arrived early. She's in the Great Hall now, but she'll be here within the hour." "Then why did you let me in?" Hermione asked, her voice a mere breath. "I didn't." He turned around, and the terror in his eyes was naked. "The door. It didn't wait for you to touch it. It opened on its own. The resonance is becoming too strong, Hermione. The castle isn't just folding, it's collapsing the distance between us." The realization hit her like a physical blow. They weren't just visiting each other. The spaces were merging. The sandalwood and the old parchment, the silver and the gold. The boundaries were dissolving. "We have to close it," she said, her logical mind finally asserting itself over the emotional chaos. "If she sees me here, it's over, for both of us." "I don't know how," Draco admitted, his voice a hollow echo. He walked toward her, his movements frantic. He grabbed her hands, his fingers interlacing with hers. The tactile friction was overwhelming, a visceral alignment that felt like it was stitching them together. "I've tried every sealing charm, every countercurse. It won't close." The sound of footsteps echoed from the corridor outside the bedroom, heavy, rhythmic, and unmistakably feminine. Narcissa Malfoy was approaching. The atmospheric pressure in the room peaked. The scent of ozone sharpened to a point of pain. Hermione looked at Draco, and in that moment of impending betrayal and shared terror, the seesaw stopped. There was no more approach or repulsion, only the visceral reality of two people who had nowhere left to hide. "Hide," he hissed, pointing toward the heavy emerald hangings of the bed. "No," she whispered, her eyes fixed on his. "If I hide, I'm just confirming what she thinks of me, of us." "Hermione, please." The use of her name, spoken with such raw, jagged desperation, did what no threat could. She saw the whitening of his knuckles, the way his eyes pleaded with her to survive. With a frantic need to protect the man she was beginning to realize she couldn't stand to lose, she stepped toward the wall. But the wall was solid. The tapestry was gone. The door had not only opened, it had vanished, leaving her trapped in the lion's den with the lion's mother at the door. The handle turned. The silver ring on Draco's hand caught the last flickering light of the candle as he stepped in front of Hermione, shielding her with his body. The silence was a jagged blade, poised to strike. The click of the door latch was a gunshot in the stagnant air of the room. Time did not merely slow, it congealed into a thick, suffocating syrup. Draco did not flinch, but Hermione could feel the seismic tremors radiating through his back where she stood pressed against him. He was a shield of bone and fine wool, his breath coming in shallow, rhythmic hitches that she could feel against her own sternum. Narcissa Malfoy stepped into the room. She was a vision of glacial elegance, draped in furs the colour of a winter dawn, her hair a silver-white crown that seemed to draw all the remaining light from the flickering candle. She did not scream. She did not gasp. She simply stopped, her gaze drifting from her son's rigid shoulders to the shadow of the girl standing behind him. The atmospheric pressure in the room surged to a breaking point. The scent of ozone, usually a herald of the passage, now felt like the static before a killing curse. "Draco," Narcissa said, her voice a low melodic chime that carried the weight of centuries of pure-blood expectation. "I expected to find you alone in your meditations. I did not realize you were entertaining guests." The word guests was a jagged impact, cold and sharp as an icicle. "Mother," Draco replied. His voice was a marvel of forced neutrality, though Hermione could see the frantic whitening of his knuckles as he gripped the back of the velvet chair. "The head girl was here on official business, a security breach in the upper corridors." "A security breach," Narcissa repeated. She moved further into the room, the silk of her skirts whispering against the rug, a sound like a serpent moving through dry grass. She stopped at the edge of the mahogany desk, her gloved hand resting near the overturned inkwell. Her eyes, the same stormy grey as her son's, but stripped of their vulnerability, fixed on Hermione. "And does this breach require such tactile proximity, Miss Granger?" Hermione stepped out from behind Draco. Her legs felt like lead, but her mind was a flare of Gryffindor defiance. She straightened her sleeve cuffs, her fingers digging into the fabric to mask their trembling. The friction of the movement felt like a grounding wire. "The castle is unstable, Lady Malfoy," Hermione said, her voice regaining its principled edge despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Spaces are overlapping. I was simply investigating the source." The silence that followed was a visceral alignment of three different worlds. Narcissa looked at the stone wall where the passage usually appeared, then back to the inflamed mark on her son's forearm, which he had not had the chance to cover. The betrayal of the secret was written in the air, thick as the scent of the sandalwood that now seemed to mock them. Narcissa's expression did not change, but a shadow of something, grief, or perhaps a terrible understanding, flickered in her eyes. "My son has spent his life trying to bridge worlds that were never meant to touch, Miss Granger. I suggest you return to yours before the collapse becomes permanent." She turned to Draco, her gaze lingering on his pale, haunted face. "We will speak of your security breaches in the morning, Draco. Ensure the girl finds her way back. I find the air in this room thin." As the door closed behind her, the magnetic pull that had held the three of them in a frozen tableau snapped. Draco collapsed into the chair, his head falling into his hands. The silence that followed was not the cold rejection of the library. It was a heavy, echoing void. Hermione didn't move toward the door. She moved toward him. The "can't help but think" had finally consumed the "can't stand it." She reached out, her hand hovering over his shoulder, before finally making contact. "Or worse, she won't, and I'll have to live with it. Or worse, she won't, and I'll have to live with the debt of her silence." "She saw the truth, Draco," Hermione said, her voice a soft velvet rasp. She knelt beside the chair, her hand sliding down to grip his wrist, her thumb brushing over the silver ring. "She saw that you aren't the monster they want you to be." He looked up then, and the look in his eyes was a slow burn of agony and desire. The tension between them, which had been building through nights of silence and days of cruelty, finally reached its peak. He didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a tactile friction that made her skin hum. "You should hate me," he breathed, his face inches from hers. The scent of rain and smoke was overwhelming. "I've spent years trying to make you small so I could feel tall. And now I'm the one on my knees." "I don't hate you," she whispered. "I hate the world that made us think we had to be enemies." The first kiss was not a gentle thing. It was an interference of two jagged souls, a desperate, visceral alignment of teeth and breath and repressed longing. It tasted of salt and the metallic tang of fear, but beneath it was a deep, grounding warmth that felt like the first time she had truly been able to breathe since the war ended. His hands were frantic, tangling in her hair, pulling her closer as if he could merge their bodies and hide within her. The atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to settle, the static softening into a steady, rhythmic thrum. They were no longer Gryffindor and Slytherin. They were two fractured pieces of a broken castle, finally clicking into place. But as he pulled back to look at her, the cold returned, not from him, but from the reality of their situation. He stayed her hands, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, starving intensity. "This changes nothing," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The world is still outside that door. My mother is still in the castle. The mark is still on my arm." "It changes everything," she countered, her fingers tracing the silver lines he had carved into his skin. "Because now I know what I'm fighting for. And it's not just a principle, Draco. It's you." He let out a jagged breath, leaning his forehead against hers. The silence was no longer a tomb. It was a sanctuary, fragile and temporary, but real. The seesaw had not stopped, but for the first time they were balanced on the same side. The wall behind them began to thrum, the low, rhythmic hum of the passage reopening. The resonance was different now, smoother, as if the castle had finally achieved the visceral alignment it had been seeking. "Go," Draco whispered, his fingers lingering on her sleeve one last time. "Before the light finds us." "I'll come back," she promised. "I know." Hermione stepped through the dissolve, but this time she didn't feel like she was escaping. She felt like she was leaving home. As she emerged into the 7th floor corridor, the scent of the dungeons lingered in her lungs, a permanent brand of sandalwood and rain. She looked back at the tapestry of Andromeda black, and for the first time, the ancient woman in the silk seemed to be smiling, a sad, knowing expression that mirrored the ache in Hermione's own heart. The conflict was not resolved. It had merely evolved. They were no longer fighting each other. They were fighting the inevitable collapse of the secret they had built in the dark. The morning light in the great hall felt like an indictment. Every whisper from the Hufflepuff table, every sharp, sidelong glance from the Slytherins, felt like a finger pointing directly at the hollow ache in Hermione's chest. The principled head girl sat with her back straight, her hands clasped tightly over a copy of the Daily Prophet. But she wasn't reading. She was listening to the static. The rumours had begun to drift through the castle like a slow-moving fog. Whispers of a girl seen in the shadows of the lower levels, of Lady Malfoy's stony silence upon her departure, of a shift in the atmospheric pressure of the school's hierarchy. Draco was absent. His seat at the end of the table was a vacant corridor of wood and silver, a gap in the world that felt more profound than any presence. Hermione's fingers brushed the cuff of her sleeve, her skin still humming with the memory of the tactile friction of his touch. The betrayal of the secret felt imminent, a storm cloud hanging over the castle, ready to drop its weight. "You're not here, Hermione." Harry's voice was a sudden, jarring impact against her thoughts. He was watching her with that quiet, post-war intensity that missed nothing. Beside him, Ron was tearing into a piece of toast, but even he looked troubled, his eyes darting toward the Slytherin table. "I'm just focused on the upcoming NEWTS, Harry," she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "Is that why you were on the 7th floor at 4 a.m? Harry asked, his voice dropping to a velvet murmur that only she could hear. "Because the map doesn't lie, Hermione. It showed you and Malfoy in the same room. A room that isn't supposed to exist." The blood drained from her face, leaving her cold as the stone of the dungeons. The visceral alignment of her two lives, the golden hero and the secret shadow, was collapsing. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She simply stood up, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a scream, and walked out of the hall. She didn't go to class. She climbed. She needed the silence of the tapestry, the tooth of the old silk against her fingertips. But as she reached the 7th floor, she found the corridor already occupied. Draco was standing before Andromeda Black, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his silver hair a pale beacon against the charcoal stone. He looked as though he had been carved from ice. The atmospheric pressure between them surged as she approached, a magnetic pull that was now laced with a desperate, frantic edge. "They know," she whispered, her voice a mere breath in the vacant corridor. "Of course they know," he said, turning to face her. His eyes were no longer stormy. They were hollow, reflecting a jagged internal monologue of guilt and resignation. "My mother didn't speak, but her silence was a loud enough confession for the portraits. The castle has ears, Hermione, and it's tired of keeping our secrets." He walked toward her, his movements brittle. He stopped just inches away, the scent of sandalwood and the sharp tang of ozone from the passage rising between them. He reached out, the bite of his silver ring against her chin as he forced her to look at him. "This is the end of the game," he said. "The board is asking questions. Your friends are watching the map. The distance between what you are and what I am is about to become a chasm again." "It doesn't have to be," she countered, her hands finding the lapels of his robes. The friction of the fabric was a grounding wire. "We can tell them. We can face it." "Tell them what?" He let out a short, jagged laugh that broke on a sob. "That the girl who helped save the world is spending her nights with a marked man in a room that shouldn't exist? That you've traded your medals for my shadows? They'll tear you apart, Hermione. They'll call it a curse. They'll say I bewitched you because they can't imagine you'd ever choose the ruin I've become." The warmth of her anger flared. a hot spark against his biting cold. "Stop deciding for me what I can handle. I've faced more than a few judgmental glances, Draco. I've faced death. And I won't be the one to bring it back to you." He pushed her away, the rejection a physical blow. The seesaw of their dynamic tilted violently into the cold. He turned to the tapestry, his wand drawn. The tip of the wood glowed with a sickly white light. "What are you doing?" she screamed, her heart performing a frantic rhythm. "I'm sealing it," he hissed, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his wand. "I'm collapsing the resonance. If there is no door, there is no Hermione in the dark. You can go back to being their icon. You can go back to the light. Don't you dare!" She lunged for his arm, her fingers digging into his skin, the visceral alignment of their bodies causing a flare of magic to erupt from the wall. The ozone sharpened to a point of agony. The tapestry began to ripple like water, the threads of silk unraveling and reweaving in a frantic, chaotic dance. The stone groaned. The very foundation of the castle seemed to shudder under the weight of their conflicting wills. The magnetic pull was no longer a hum. It was a roar, a localized storm of light and shadow that threatened to swallow them both. "Let go, Hermione!" Draco roared over the sound of the magic. "Let me save you." "I don't want to be saved. I want to be with you." The admission hung in the air, a raw, jagged truth that silenced the roaring magic. For a second, the atmospheric pressure reached a point of absolute stillness. Draco's wand hand faltered. He looked at her, his face a mask of profound, aching vulnerability. The "can't help but think" had finally, irrevocably won. But as the light began to fade, a new sound echoed from the end of the corridor, the heavy, rhythmic thud of many footsteps. The headmistress, the governors, her friends. The world was coming for them. Draco looked at the wall, then back at her. The choice was a jagged blade. He could seal the door and pretend she had never been there, or he could leave it open and let the world see the wreckage of their hearts. "Hermione," he breathed, his voice a velvet rasp of pure, unadulterated terror and love. He didn't seal the door. He grabbed her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a visceral alignment that felt permanent. He didn't hide. He stood with her before the shimmering, unstable wall, their shadows merging into one dark shape against the stone. The first of the observers rounded the corner. Harry, his face a map of shock and betrayal. Behind him, McGonagall, her lips a thin line of ancient concern. The tension in the corridor was a physical weight, a pressure that felt like it would crush the lungs of everyone present. The secret was out. The door that led to Draco's bedroom was no longer a hidden anomaly. It was a gateway to a new, terrifying reality. "Miss Granger," McGonagall said, her voice a low chime in the silence. "Mr. Malfoy, explain yourselves." Draco didn't speak. He simply tightened his grip on Hermione's hand, the silver of his ring biting into her palm. He looked at his peers, his enemies, and his mentors with a cold, marble-like defiance. Hermione took a breath, the scent of sandalwood still deep in her lungs. She looked at Harry, then back to the man beside her. The seesaw had stopped. There was no more warmth and cold, no more approach and repulsion. There was only the threshold. "The castle didn't make a mistake," she said, her voice steady and clear as a bell. "It just found the only two people who were brave enough to walk through the dark." The silence that followed was the heaviest of all. It was the sound of a world changing. The conflict was no longer internal. It was a war against the expectations of the entire wizarding world. But as Draco leaned his shoulder against hers, the tactile friction of his presence gave her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. They were standing at the edge of the abyss, but for the first time, they weren't falling. They were standing. The aftermath of the exposure was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing cooling of the atmosphere. The 7th floor corridor remained frozen in a tableau of shock. Harry's hand was still on his wand, though it pointed toward the floor, his eyes darting between Hermione's defiant expression and the way Draco's fingers were inextricably locked with hers. The silence was a physical weight, a pressure that felt as though the castle itself were holding its breath, waiting for the foundation to crack. "To your common rooms, all of you." McGonagall's voice finally cut through the static, sharp and brittle as parchment. "Mr. Malfoy, Miss Granger, my office, now." The walk through the castle was a gauntlet of tactile friction. Every pair of eyes they passed felt like a needle prick. Draco did not let go of her hand. His grip was a visceral alignment, a grounding force that kept Hermione from dissolving into the sheer panic that threatened to overwhelm her logic. He walked with his head held high, his features returned to their marble-like composure. Yet she could feel the frantic, rhythmic pulse in his palm against hers. Inside the headmistress's office, the air smelled of lemon drops and ancient magic. The portraits of past headmasters whispered behind their frames, a cacophony of judgment that Draco ignored with practiced ease. "Explain," McGonagall said, sitting behind her desk. She didn't look angry. She looked profoundly tired, as if the weight of the post-war world had finally settled into her marrow. "There is nothing to explain that the castle hasn't already said," Draco replied, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He stood beside Hermione, their shoulders brushing, a constant magnetic pull. "The magic found a fracture. We simply stepped into it." "A fracture, Mr. Malfoy, or a dereliction of duty." McGonagall's gaze turned to Hermione. "Miss Granger, you are the head girl. You were tasked with maintaining order, not vanishing into the shadows of a man whose family's legacy is still being scrubbed from these walls." The words were a sharp impact, but they didn't draw blood. Hermione straightened her sleeve cuffs, a final, nervous gesture before she let her hands fall still at her sides. "I haven't vanished, Professor," Hermione said, her voice clear and resonant. "If anything, I've finally been found. The order you want me to maintain is based on a world that demands we remain enemies to prove we are good. I won't participate in that anymore. If being principled means ignoring the humanity of someone who is suffering, then I don't want the title." The silence that followed was the longest yet. It was the sound of a bridge being burnt, the wood popping and hissing in the heat of her conviction. Draco looked at her then, and the expression in his grey eyes was a slow burn of awe and something that looked dangerously like hope. The consequences were swift, but lacked the finality they both expected. There were no expulsions. The school could not afford the scandal, but there was a profound, biting cold that settled over their daily lives. Hermione was stripped of her badge, a loss that felt surprisingly light, like shedding a skin that had grown too tight. Draco was placed under even stricter supervision, but the board could not touch him without involving Narcissa, who remained enigmatically silent in the weeks that followed. The door behind the Andromeda tapestry was sealed by a team of ministry unspeakables. The spatial anomaly was smoothed over, the threads of silk rewoven into a permanent static pattern. The secret sanctuary was gone, but the visceral alignment remained. They met now in the light. It was harder, more jagged. There was no velvet furniture or flickering candlelight to soften the edges of their reality. They met in the library, under the watchful, judging eyes of Madame Pince, or by the black lake where the wind bit into their skin. The seesaw of their relationship had reached a state of equilibrium, a steady, constant tension that was no longer about approach and repulsion, but about endurance. A month later, Hermione found Draco by the water. The spring air was still laced with winter's teeth, and the lake was a dark, restless mirror. He was wearing his heavy cloak, the silver signet ring catching the pale sun. He didn't look up as she approached, but he shifted his stance to make room for her in his shadow. The atmospheric pressure between them was quiet now, a low hum of static that felt like a heartbeat. "They're still talking," he said, his voice a velvet murmur. "I heard Finnegan today. He thinks I used a confundus on you. He can't wrap his head around the idea that the brightest witch of her age would choose a rot like me." "Let them talk," Hermione replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. The scent of him, sandalwood and the crispness of the lake filled her lungs. The light makes people see what they want to see. Only the dark showed us the truth. Draco turned to her, his hand reaching out to trace the line of her jaw. The tactile friction was slow, deliberate. His thumb brushed her lower lip, a visceral alignment that made the rest of the world fade into a hollow echo. "The door is gone, Hermione," he whispered, his eyes searching hers. "There's no secret way back to the room where we were just two people. We're in the world now. It's loud, and it's cold, and it hates us." "I know," she said, her fingers interlacing with his, the bite of his ring a familiar, grounding pressure. "But we aren't in the dark anymore, Draco, and I've found that the world is much easier to face when you aren't trying to hide the most honest part of yourself." He leaned down, and this time the kiss was not a desperate interference of fear. It was a promise. It was slow, emotional, and carried the weight of everything they had survived: the insults, the marks, the doubt, and the betrayals. It was the resolution of a conflict that had started in a hallway centuries old and ended in the raw, honest light of a new day. As they walked back toward the castle, their shadows stretched out long and joined behind them. They passed the 7th floor corridor one last time. The tapestry of Andromeda black hung silent and still, a mere piece of art on a stone wall. The passage was gone, but as Hermione glanced at the silk, she realized she no longer needed it. The door that led to Draco's bedroom had served its purpose. It had been the breach through which she had entered his heart and the exit through which he had escaped his own tomb. The castle was just a building again. The magic was no longer in the walls or the spatial folds. It was in the rhythmic, steady pulse of their joined hands, and the fact that, for the first time in either of their lives, the distance between enemy and lover had been closed forever. The seesaw had stopped. They had finally stepped off the ride and onto solid ground together. The hawthorn trees on the edge of the forbidden forest were in full, aggressive bloom, their cloying, honey-sweet scent drifting through the open windows of the library. To anyone else, it was the smell of spring and the promise of a world renewing itself. To Hermione, it felt like an invitation she wasn't allowed to accept. The atmosphere in the castle had shifted from the volatile static of discovery to a heavy, stagnant chill. It was a social boycott, clinical and precise. Her seat at the Gryffindor table was now a deserted island. Her classmates didn't scream or curse. They simply became air whenever she approached. The rhythmic scratching of her quill was often the only sound in the common room when she entered, a visceral alignment of her presence and their sudden, pointed silence. She sat in an alcove of the library, the tooth of old parchment beneath her fingers feeling more like a shroud than a comfort. She was no longer the girl who knew the answers. She was the girl who had asked the wrong questions of a Malfoy. The shadow that fell across her desk was not the sharp, jagged intrusion of weeks past. It was steady, a grounding weight that preceded the scent of rain and expensive soap. Draco did not speak immediately. He leaned against the bookshelf, his arms crossed, his silver hair catching the late afternoon sun. He looked tired, not the hollow exhaustion of the dungeons, but a weighted, mature fatigue. The atmospheric pressure in the alcove surged, the magnetic pull between them tightening until the air felt thick as honey. "You're holding that quill so hard the wood is going to splinter, Hermione." The use of her name was a velvet rasp that broke the spell of her isolation. She didn't look up, her eyes fixed on her notes. "I'm fine, Draco. I'm just focused." Liar. He stepped into the alcove, the tactile friction of his presence making the fine hairs on her arms stand rigid. He reached out, his hand covering hers. The bite of his silver ring against her skin was a cold, metallic anchor. "They're treating you like a leper, and you're pretending it's just a quiet study period." "I made my choice," she whispered, finally looking up. Her eyes were bright with a raw, jagged vulnerability. "I knew the world wouldn't move over to make room for us. Then we'll make our own world." He reached into the pocket of his robes and pulled out a small, unassuming square of parchment. It wasn't the heavy, cream-coloured vellum of the Malfoy estate. It was frayed at the edges, looking almost like a scrap she might have discarded. "What is it?" "A sympathetic resonance," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur. "I've been working on it in the potions lab. It's keyed to the same frequency as the door." He placed it on the table between them. As his fingers left the parchment, it began to glow with a soft, amber light, a warmth that seemed to radiate through the cold library air. "It doesn't open a door," he explained, his gaze searching hers with a desperate, starving intensity. "But whenever I'm thinking of you, whenever the can't help but think gets too loud, it vibrates, just enough to let you know that you aren't alone in the dark, even when the light is being cruel." Hermione reached out, her fingertips brushing the parchment. It hummed against her skin, a steady, rhythmic vibration that felt exactly like the pulse in Draco's wrist. The visceral alignment was so profound, it brought tears to her eyes. It was a bridge built of ink and intent, a way to defy the silence of the world outside their alcove. "You stayed up all night making this," she noted, her voice trembling. I stayed up all night realizing that I've spent my life following rules written by dead men, he replied. He leaned down, his forehead pressing against hers. The scent of him drowned out the hawthorn, a grounding mixture of sandalwood and resolve. They can take your badge, they can take your friends, but they can't take the fact that I am yours, Hermione, in the dark, in the light, and in whatever ruins we have to walk through next. The seesaw of her doubt, which had been tilting toward the cold all morning, finally snapped into a permanent, steady warmth. She let out a shuddering breath, her fingers interlacing with his. The friction of his palm against hers was no longer a secret. It was a manifesto. The weight of the silver ring against her hand was no longer a reminder of his family sins, but a promise of a future where the only threshold they had to cross was the one they chose together. As the sun set, casting long, joined shadows across the library floor, Hermione realized that the boycott didn't matter. The silence of the castle was nothing compared to the resonance of the man standing beside her. The iron gates of Malfoy Manor did not screech. They breathed, a low, rhythmic groan of ancient metal that felt like a warning in the pit of Hermione's stomach. The air here was different from the highlands of Scotland. It was heavy, laden with the scent of damp earth, clipped boxwood, and the cold metallic tang of stagnant magic. As they walked up the long gravel drive, the white peacocks drifted through the mist like ghosts of a former life. Hermione's fingers were curled so tightly into the wool of her coat that her knuckles had turned the color of the fog. Beside her, Draco walked with a rigid, clinical grace. He didn't look at the towering hedges or the dark windows of the drawing room. His gaze was fixed forward, but his hand was an iron vice around hers, the silver ring biting into her palm with every step. "You don't have to do this," he whispered, his voice a jagged rasp that barely carried over the crunch of gravel. "We could have met in London. We could have gone to the coast." "We can't build a house on top of a grave, Draco," she replied, her voice steady despite the frantic, irregular rhythm of her heart. "We have to see it in the light. Otherwise, the dark will always be waiting for us here." The entrance hall was a cathedral of marble and shadow. The silence was absolute, a visceral alignment of stone and history that seemed to press against their eardrums. Draco led her toward the double doors of the drawing room. As he reached for the silver handles, the atmospheric pressure surged. The scent of ozone, the ghost of 1,000 hexes, sharpened the air until it tasted like copper. The doors swung open. The room was bathed in the grey, filtered light of a Wiltshire afternoon. It was immaculate. The blood had been scrubbed from the floorboards. The furniture had been restored. The chandelier hung like a frozen explosion of crystal. But the memory of the screaming remained, a psychic static that made Hermione's breath hitch. She stopped in the center of the rug, her eyes fixed on the spot where she had once looked up at a ceiling she thought she would never see again. The friction of the past against the present was a jarring impact. She felt a sudden, frantic need to straighten her sleeve cuffs, her fingers fumbling with the buttons as if they could shield her from the history of the room. "It's empty," Draco said. He was standing a few feet away, his shadow long and thin on the polished wood. "My mother has moved to the East Wing. She She doesn't come in here anymore. It's not empty, Draco. It's full of us. He moved then, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He didn't go to her. He went to the spot where he had stood that night, a silent witness to his own soul's erosion. He looked down at the floor, his face turning to marble. The seesaw of his internal conflict, the shame versus the longing, was visible in the whitening of his jaw. Then he did something that shattered the last of the pure-blood armor. He knelt. He didn't bow his head in a theatrical display of grief. He simply lowered himself onto the spot where she had bled, his hands resting flat against the floorboards. The visceral alignment of the man and his sin was a slow burn of agony. I stood here, he breathed, his voice breaking on the words. I stood here, and I let the world turn black. I told myself I was protecting my mother. I told myself I had no choice. But the truth is, I was a coward, and every time I touch you, I wonder why you don't recoil from the hands that did nothing. Hermione's heart performed a jagged, aching rhythm. She crossed the distance between them, her boots making soft thuds on the wood. She didn't stay standing. She knelt in front of him, her knees brushing his, her hands reaching out to cup his face. The tactile friction of her warm skin against his biting chill was a reclamation. You weren't a coward, Draco. You were a boy in a cage built before you were born, she said, her eyes searching his stormy grey ones. The hands that did nothing then are the hands that hold me now. You're choosing the light every day you stay by my side. That is the only choice that matters. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. The scent of sandalwood and old dust filled her lungs, a mixture of the man he was and the house he was trying to heal. The atmospheric pressure in the room finally began to drop, the static of the past replaced by a steady, grounding thrum of mutual forgiveness. We're going to change it, she whispered. The books, the lights, the windows. We'll turn this room into a library. We'll fill it with words that build things instead of spells that tear them down. Draco let out a shuddering breath, his hands coming up to grip her wrists. The silver ring pressed against her pulse, a permanent brand of their visceral alignment. He looked around the room, and for the first time, the tomb looked like nothing more than a collection of wood and stone. A library, he repeated, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, the first real warmth she had seen in his eyes since the night by the lake. I think the house might like that. It's been hungry for a different kind of magic for a long time. As they stood up together, the weight of the manor seemed to lift. The seesaw had finally settled into a quiet, permanent equilibrium. They walked out of the drawing room hand in hand, leaving the ghosts behind in the dust. The door didn't lead to a bedroom or a secret. It led to a hallway, and at the end of that hallway, the front door was standing wide open, letting in the scent of the spring rain. The air on the coast of France did not carry the heavy, ancient weight of Hogwarts or the suffocating silence of Malfoy Manor. It was a visceral alignment of salt, wild lavender, and the sharp, clean sting of the Atlantic. Here, the light was different. It was a pale, honeyed gold that felt like a benediction rather than an indictment. Their cottage sat on a jagged cliffside, its white stone walls weathered by the wind. It was a small space, but for the first time in their lives, It was a space they had chosen. There were no tapestries of ancestors here, no hidden doors, and no secret passages. Every threshold was clear. Every window was wide open to the horizon. Hermione sat at a heavy oak table in the garden, her fingers stained with the dark indigo of enchanted ink. She was drafting the final revisions for the Sentient Rights Act, a piece of legislation that had already begun to ripple through the ministry back in London. The rhythmic scratching of her quill was a grounding thrum, a steady pulse of her own making. The shadow that fell across her parchment was warm. Draco approached from the direction of his small laboratory, a converted stone shed at the edge of the property. He had traded his stiff black robes for a soft linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His pale forearms, once a map of shame and scars, were now smudged with the silver dust of crushed moonstone and the green sap of valerian. He didn't speak. He simply stopped behind her chair, his hands resting on her shoulders. The tactile friction of his palms through her thin sweater sent a familiar, comforting tremor through her. The atmospheric pressure between them was no longer a storm. It was a calm, steady hum. "A letter arrived," he said, his voice a low velvet rasp that the sea breeze couldn't carry away. He set a piece of parchment on the table. Hermione's breath hitched. It wasn't the official seal of the ministry or the cold vellum of a solicitor. It was a messy, slanted scrawl on common parchment, smelling faintly of gunpowder and Ron's favourite brand of owl treats. "Hermione, Draco," it began. The new legislation passed the first reading. "Harry says the office feels empty without you, but he stopped scowling at the mention of the manor. If you're both still in France next month, we'd like to visit. R.W." The silence that followed was not a void. It was a resolution. The visceral alignment of their past lives and their present peace was finally complete. The seesaw of doubt, betrayal, and cold rejection had reached its final permanent stop. "They're coming," she whispered, her fingers tracing the ink. "They're coming," Draco echoed. He leaned down, pressing his face into the curve of her neck. The scent of him, sandalwood, sea salt, and the ozone of a successful potion overwhelmed her. He reached for her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. The bite of his silver ring against her skin was no longer a brand of his lineage, but a seal of their shared life. He pulled her to her feet, and they walked toward the house. The wooden door stood open, the interior of the cottage visible in the soft evening light, books piled on every surface, a shared desk, 2 chairs by a hearth that was currently cold because they no longer needed the fire to feel warmth. They stopped at the threshold. Draco looked at her, his stormy grey eyes now clear as the ocean after a gale. There were no masks left, no secrets to guard, no doors to hide behind. "We aren't in the dark anymore, are we?" he asked, his voice a soft, emotional rasp. "No," Hermione replied, stepping across the threshold and pulling him with her. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be." The door closed with a soft, final thud. It wasn't a door that led to a bedroom, or a secret, or a ruin. It was just a door to a home. And as the sun dipped below the Atlantic, the light in the windows stayed on, a steady, unwavering glow in the vast, open world. 5 years later, the architecture of light, the evening sun over the coast of Normandy, did not merely set. It dissolved into the Atlantic, turning the water into liquid gold that shimmered like a freshly minted galleon. Hermione Granger stood on the stone terrace of their home, her fingers wrapped around a glass of chilled white wine. The wind from the ocean played with the loose curls of her hair, strands she had long ago stopped trying to tame with charms. In this air, there was no scent of gunpowder, no lingering ghost of old blood, or the damp chill of dungeon stone. Here, there was only salt, wild lavender, and the terrifying, beautiful weight of freedom. It had been 5 years since the doors of Hogwarts closed behind them. 5 years since the wall behind the Andromeda black tapestry became, once again, nothing more than a solid boundary of masonry and silk. She heard his footsteps before he even opened the glass doors. It was a specific atmospheric shift, a steady, heavy resonance that had long ago lost the brittle sharpness of his youth. Draco approached from behind, silent as a shadow, yet his presence felt like warm, static electricity against her skin. He slid his arms around her waist, and Hermione instinctively leaned her head back against his shoulder, closing her eyes. "You're overthinking again, Granger," he murmured into the curve of her neck. His voice, once a blade of icy arrogance, had deepened into a velvet rasp that served as her anchor. "I was thinking about the architecture of things," she replied, her voice a mere breath against the sea breeze. "How we spent so much time hiding in rooms that didn't exist, only to end up in a place where there are no walls at all." Draco tightened his grip. His hands, once pale and trembling with the weight of a mark he never asked for, were now calloused from his work in the laboratory and tanned by the French sun. On his finger, the Malfoy signet ring remained, the silver bite of it pressing into her skin. But it no longer felt like a shackle. It was merely metal. "The castle gave us what we needed," Draco said, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the blue met the gold. "A place to be monsters together so we could learn how to be human out here." The interior of their cottage was a visceral alignment of two lives that should have never intersected. It was a beautiful, chaotic interference of Gryffindor clutter and Slytherin precision. Mahogany bookshelves stretched to the ceiling, groaning under the weight of ancient leather-bound grimoires and modern Muggle paperbacks. On the mantel, a magical clock ticked with a rhythmic, heavy pulse, not counting the hours, but tracking the location and safety of the people who inhabited the house. Hermione walked toward the large oak desk that dominated the living area. It was covered in parchment, her latest drafts for the restructuring of the Wizengamot. Beside her notes lay a small frayed square of parchment that vibrated with a soft amber glow. She picked it up, feeling the magnetic pull of his thoughts even now, while he stood only a few feet away. "Harry sent a Patronus this morning," she said, turning the parchment over in her hands. "He and Ginny are coming for the solstice. And Ron asked if he could bring the new girl he's seeing, an apprentice healer from St. Mungo's." Draco let out a short, jagged laugh that lacked its former venom. He walked to the sideboard and poured himself a measure of amber liquid. No longer the cheap fire whiskey of his dark years, but a sophisticated French vintage. The great hall would have imploded at the thought. The Saviour, the Weasel, and the Death Eater sharing a vintage Burgundy on a cliffside. "It's almost offensive, isn't it?" "It's progress," Hermione countered, walking over to him. She reached out, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. The tactile friction of his skin made her heart perform a steady, familiar rhythm. It's the world catching up to the door we opened 5 years ago. Draco set his glass down, the clack of crystal against wood echoing in the quiet room. He looked at her then, and the stormy grey of his eyes was filled with a raw, staring intensity. The seesaw of their past, the approach and repulsion, had long since settled into a permanent, visceral alignment. "I still wake up sometimes," he whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, honest level. "In the middle of the night, reaching for the stone wall, waiting for the static, waiting for the moment I have to shove you out because my mother is at the door." Hermione stepped into his space, her hands finding the lapels of his linen shirt. "But the door is open now, Draco, and there's no one on the other side but us." As night fell, the cottage became a sanctuary of candlelight and sandalwood. They sat together by the hearth, not because it was cold, but because the fire provided a rhythmic, flickering light that reminded them of the first night in the dungeon. Hermione was reading, but her eyes kept drifting to Draco. He was sketching a diagram for a new potion, a stabilizer for long-term Cruciatus survivors. The whitening of his knuckles as he gripped the charcoal showed his focus, a manifestation of the guilt he had turned into a life's work. He didn't just want to be better. He wanted to heal the world he had helped to fracture. The silence between them was heavy, but it was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a library, full of stories, possibilities, and unwritten chapters. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked suddenly, not looking up from his parchment. "The adrenaline, the thrill of the secret, the way the air felt like it was going to explode every time we touched." Hermione closed her book, her thumb marking the page. She thought of the 7th floor corridor. She thought of the scent of ozone and the tooth of the old silk tapestry. She thought of the terror that had made every kiss feel like a final meal. "No," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I loved the door because it led to you, but I love this house because it belongs to us. I don't want the static anymore, Draco. I want the peace." He looked up then, and the smile that touched his lips was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. A slow, emotional thaw that had taken 5 years to fully bloom. He reached out, his hand covering hers on the arm of the chair. The silver ring bit into her skin, a familiar, grounding pressure. "The architecture of light," he murmured, repeating her words from earlier. "Yes," she replied. They sat there for a long time, two fractured souls who had found a visceral alignment in the most unlikely of spaces. The world outside was vast, loud, and still complicated, but within the white stone walls of their cottage, the war was truly over. There were no secret passages left to find, no hidden doors to unlock. They had walked through the most dangerous threshold of all, the one that led from who they were supposed to be to who they actually were. And as the last of the candles flickered out, the only light remaining was the soft amber hum of the parchment on the desk, vibrating with the steady, unbreakable rhythm of two hearts that had finally found their way home.
We often think that people are our enemies. We think we know everything about them. We see their labels, we see their mistakes, but sometimes we just need right door to open. In this story, Draco and Hermione found a room that did not exist. In that room, they were not the Golden Girl or the Death Eater. They were just two broken people. They found that pain feels the same for everyone. Love is not easy. It is like a storm. It can be cold and hard, but it is the only thing that can fix a broken heart. I hope this story reminded you of one thing. Even in the dark, there is always a way to find the light. You just have to be brave enough to walk through the door. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here with me.